All right, guys, we have a screencast on abolition that I promised. The screencast on the abolition movement and also pro-slavery arguments that South had. So quickly, when we look at this, abolition is simply people who advocated for the immediate, complete, and total unconditional end to slavery in the United States. What to understand is this movement was around for a long time, especially by the Quakers. Quakers have always been, peaceful, and since the 1700s, since arriving here, and as the country got together, they were leading abolitionists trying to end slavery, petitioning the government, things of that nature, even petitioning the British government to do it. Um, but it wasn't a movement per se, it was a small group of religious people doing this. The slave trade was abolished in 1808. But that did not abolish slavery. All that did was make the slaves that were here more like property and more valuable, and made slaves. If you could make more slaves, if you get what I'm saying, that could be a very profitable business also. What abolition sprung from is something called the Second Great Awakening. It was a religious movement in Upper New York and New England. Um, it was to return to the church, to return to a more godlike state, to live a more pious and moral life. And so when you look at that, slavery does not fit with that. So, springing from the Second Great Awakening, you have a much heavier abolition movement, especially in the New England states. Um, this is going to continue to grow through the 50s, the 40s, I should say the 40s, the 50s, and after the raid at Harper's Ferry, you are going to see a larger abolition movement in the North. Um, but what to remember here is always that even as most whites in the New England area are going to start becoming abolitionists, or you're going to start questioning the morality of slavery, or from Pennsylvania up, even say that you're going to start questioning the need for slavery in a country such as the United States. Most Northern whites are still going to be extremely racist, and they're not going to consider that African Americans are on the same playing field as whites. They're going to be very racist about it. So we should end slavery, but then what do you do with African Americans? When you look at that, some names you should know. William Lloyd Garrison is going to be the publisher of a newspaper in Boston called The Liberator. It's going to be the most prominent anti-slavery publication of its day. Um, it will blame the United States government, and it will condemn the South, and it will piss off the South. His name of his newspaper is again The Liberator. Frederick Douglass, we guys should know him pretty well. He also creates a newspaper. He writes for William Lloyd Garrison in The Liberator. Um, he also creates his own newspaper later called The Star. But he's a leading abolitionist in the North as a free slave. Harriet Beecher Stowe, you should know her from your readings. Uncle Tom's Cabin, we'll get to that in another PowerPoint. And Harriet Tubman, again, you should know her. Underground Railroad. These are all people that contributed to the abolition movement of the North, and we're working our way down. Um, but they definitely did, especially when you look at how William Lloyd Garrison for his newspaper, Harriet Beecher Stowe, especially for Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman as former slaves advocating what the problems were of slavery. So, what abolition arguments do you have? What arguments will they use? Well, very simply, that is morally unjust and wrong. That springs from that Second Great Awakening. This argument springs from the liberty, the all men are created equal, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness thing. Our government and our country is supposed to be framed on, and that's just not happening when you include African American slaves. Religiously reprehensible. You're going to have a religious movement. Again, the Second Great Awakening was a religious movement. But if you go to the New Testament, the Beatitudes, Christian teachings of the New Testament, turn the other cheek, things of that nature, treat others as you want to be treated. Slavery is then a religiously reprehensible condition to have other humans in. Economically, there was a book that was published, which we'll get to in another PowerPoint, but it's basically arguing that the South is stunning the growth of the nation. And why is the South doing that? Because they operate slave labor, and that means the South can't compete internationally, which means the nation can't compete internationally. So economically, they're going to say, abolitionists, is that slavery is actually counterproductive to pushing the nation forward to compete on an international stage, which is what they want to do. And politically, again, you go, it's kind of with the moral argument, but it is that this is against our Constitution. How in the world can you have someone living in slavery and advocate for life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness as our Constitution does? Um, it, or I should say the Declaration of Independence, but the Constitution also has, we the people, and you guys know that from 10th grade. And what happens there is because slaves are not citizens, and that'll come out with Dred Scott, is that the Constitution does not apply. So that's another movement there. So now you look at the counters to this, and there has been IB questions on slavery and defending slavery from a Southern point of view, or what was the defenses of slavery, and is it defensible? So when you look at this, you have, first of all, what to understand is there was this thing called Nat Turner's Rebellion. It was basically a slave rebellion in Upper Virginia that freaked the South out because it killed about 58 whites. So for a good 2 or 3 years after that, there was widespread panic, and there was retributions and lynch mobs, and there was probably over 150 slaves killed. There were 48 slaves tried in this. So what happens is, for about a little tiny bit, Virginia legislature contemplates abolition, but of course they go nah, and they instead go with laws to repress slaves that are spread across the South. No reading, no writing. Slaves can't be taught, things of that nature. More repressive policies as far as punishment. So from that Turner Rebellion really springs the real, we are going to get tough with slavery, let's call it. So when you think about it, then you have these other arguments springing from that, because Nat Turner's Rebellion shows that some of these arguments, wow, they're true, even though it's slaves trying to get their freedom. So you have what's called the paternalism argument. The paternalism argument is that the master takes better care of their slave than the child can, the child being the slave. So the master is like the father or the mother. And if you don't take care of these slaves, the paternalism argument of slavery is that, well, look, they're gonna go crazy. Look at Nat Turner's Rebellion. Look at what happened in Haiti. There was a slave rebellion in Haiti that succeeded. Or they'll just wander aimlessly and they'll die from hunger and starvation. So again, not taking into account intelligence and just saying, this is just good for them, the slave. The economic argument, the I know you are, but what am I? Again, the North is going to accuse the South of being economically stunted. They are going to say, look what's happening here. You guys are so behind the times. The Southern response is actually that when you look at Northern industrialism, that there is a class struggle going on, that you're going to have the rich versus the poor. It's kind of a communist manifesto in a way, because what it is saying is that you have a class struggle. You're going to have the poor that are struggling to get to where the rich are, and that doesn't happen in the South. We're tranquil, we're peaceful. And you know what? At least we call our workers slaves, because what the South will say is that Northern free labor is just another form of slavery. It's called wage slaves. So they will combat that economic turn. And when you go into it, there's actually a historian called Howard Zinn that will say the overlooked civil war during these years will be the wage slave war of the rich and the poor in the North. So that is actually, there is some historiography on the subject that there was definitely class struggle, but I don't know if it's a great pro-slavery argument. As the eternal Rachel Foley said, mere slavery. The religious argument that the South has, they counter the New Testament argument with the Old Testament argument that, look, there's slavery in the Bible, and basically if you look at the Old Testament, life sucks. You're gonna have bad conditions in life, so you just suck it up, drive on, and everybody, even the slave, will be rewarded in heaven. Again, not a great argument. The superior argument that basically whites are just better, and somebody has to be the mudsill is the statement, is the saying. It basically just means somebody needs to be on the bottom, and it's not going to be us whites. So again, when you look at all of these arguments, they're pretty terrible arguments for pro-slavery, but it's arguments that they use. And the last argument was pretty true. The South and the North would say, listen, it's going to take a violent uprising to get rid of slavery in the South, and this country is too fragile right now, the politics are too fragile, it would probably break this country apart, so it's best to just leave slavery alone. And I guess this one was true because of what breaks out in 1861. So there your quick PowerPoint on abolition and on the anti and pro-slavery arguments. This all should be written down, and this is definitely something to be studied for time writings in IB.